An introduction to safeguarding of vulnerable adults. Topics covered. In this first module, we will cover the following topics. What is safeguarding? The basic principles of safeguarding vulnerable adults. Different issues safeguarding cover. Identifying vulnerable adults. Safeguarding adults and vulnerable adults. Why is training important to safeguarding of vulnerable adults? What is safeguarding? The idea of safeguarding has existed for several decades, and many people still don't realize exactly what it involves. Safeguarding is the general term used in the UK and Ireland, which sets out measures to protect the health, well-being, and human rights of individuals. Safeguarding can be used in a number of different situations, in particular relating to children, young people, and vulnerable adults. And this is to ensure that individuals can live free from abuse, harm, and neglect. Everybody has the right to live their lives free from harm, and it is especially important that anybody who is seen as vulnerable feels safe and protected. The basic principles of safeguarding vulnerable adults. There are 6 basic principles to safeguarding which are outlined in the CARE Act 2014. The following principles outlines the safeguarding of adults. Empowerment. This is where the individuals are supported and encouraged to confidently make their own decisions and give consent to matters regarding their care. Prevention. Try and take action before harm occurs in the first place. Proportionality. Responding to a safeguarding issue in the most unobtrusive way possible, taking into account that individual's needs. Protection. Support and representation for those in greatest need by responding immediately to concerns and taking action to remove the individual from the situation. Partnership. Local solutions, working with services with their communities. This helps prevent, detect, and report suspected cases of abuse and neglect. Accountability. To be answerable for something within their power with regards to safeguarding practices. These principles are used to emphasize the fact that everybody, no matter what their circumstance, are human beings with both wants and needs. Different issues safeguarding covers. There are many different situations in which safeguarding becomes relevant. Circumstances in which an adult or child can become vulnerable vary. Some of these situations include human trafficking, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, and transferring of persons for the purpose of exploitation. This is usually done by the use of threats, abduction, and deception, with the purpose of using them as commodities for acts such as forced labor and forced prostitution. Domestic violence and abuse. An incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, threatening, degrading, and violent behavior, including sexual violence. In the majority of cases, this is usually carried out by a partner or ex-partner, but also family members and carers. Modern slavery. Much like human trafficking, modern slavery is the exploitation of persons carried out by threats and violence. Female genital mutilation. A procedure where the female genitals are deliberately cut, injured, or changed, but with no medical purpose for it to be done. It is usually carried out on girls aged between infancy and 15. Illegal in the UK, it is common practice in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Dignity, an individual's own sense of self-respect and self-worth. How to identify a vulnerable adult. A vulnerable adult is a person over the age of 18 who is at the risk of harm or who lacks the most basic life skills to look after themselves. These persons are unable rather than unwilling to learn or maintain these life skills. To be deemed vulnerable, the persons must be unable to alter or improve their circumstances through their own actions without the assistance of more capable adults. They must also be considered as a risk to themselves if assistance isn't provided. Many adults who we deem to be vulnerable are from all walks of life. Examples of those who may be the most at risk are adults with mental health problems, making them a potential risk of harm to themselves or others, alcohol and drug-related issues, suffering both mentally and physically and being a potential risk to themselves, disabilities, both mentally and physically, making them vulnerable, the homeless, may be suffering physically and emotionally, elderly, may suffer from mental or physical frailties contributing to their vulnerability. However, not everybody who falls into these categories is necessarily vulnerable. Safeguarding adults and vulnerable adults. Everybody has the right to feel safe and to live without fear of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. To safeguard adults and vulnerable adults, we follow the basic principles of the CARE Act 2014. The Act recognizes that local authorities cannot safeguard individuals by themselves. They can only achieve this by working closely with the police, NHS, and other key organizations as well as awareness of the general public. The CARE Act requires that each of these local authorities must make inquiries in relation to an adult if they are believed to be at risk of abuse or neglect. An inquiry should determine if any action is required to stop abuse or neglect, and if so, by whom. Set up a Safeguarding Adults Board. Arrange where appropriate for an independent body to support and represent the adult who is the subject of the safeguarding inquiry. Cooperate with all relevant organizations in order to protect adults experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect. Why is training important to safeguarding of vulnerable adults? Training is important when aiming to safeguard vulnerable adults. When working with vulnerable adults, it is important to understand what abuse is. Understanding what constitutes as abuse and how it affects one individual to another is important in stopping the abuse or neglect from continuing. The situations where an adult is at risk. Identifying situations where there is a possible risk means we can prevent harm as early as possible. The signs of abuse. Recognizing signs of abuse or neglect early means that appropriate action can be taken as soon as possible to remove that individual from harm and give them the help and support they need as quickly as possible. The importance of taking action. Taking the appropriate steps in reporting any abuse or neglect means helping the individual in getting removed from the situation as quickly as possible and providing them with the necessary support they require. Good practice guidelines. Following procedures properly to ensure the well-being of the individual is a priority. Understanding different individuals' needs. Realize that different people may have different needs and not applying one-size-fits-all approach. All these factors are key to providing adults with the appropriate support that they may need. This provides the adults with the best care they require for their own individual needs. Summary. In this module, we have looked at safeguarding of vulnerable adults and the different circumstances in which they can become vulnerable. We have looked at what makes somebody vulnerable and why this is. The key things we have learned are: safeguarding is the measure taken to protect health and well-being. Everybody has the right to feel safe and live without fear. Circumstances where a child or adult is subjected to domestic violence and abuse, modern slavery, human trafficking, female genital mutilation. Training in safeguarding so they can recognize the signs of abuse or neglect and act upon it appropriately to help the individual and give them the support they will need. To safeguard vulnerable adults, we follow the basic principles of the CARE Act 2014.